Daniel Andrews this afternoon resigned as Victorian Premier in a shock announcement. He gave a snap press conference with his wife, Catherine, to announce he'd visit the Governor to resign as Premier and member for Mulgrave 9 years after he was sworn in as the 48th Premier of Victoria. Andrews said he wants to leave the state while he's on top. But critics are scathing and say he leaves behind a broken state with record debt levels.
It's not an easy job being Premier of our state. That's not a complaint, that's just a fact. It requires 100% from you and your family. To a certain extent, every waking moment is about the work, and that takes a toll.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was apparently shocked to hear the news, even though Eddie Maguire had known about it earlier in the day. Albanese described Andrews as having a passion for infrastructure and praised his tenure in the top job. He described Andrews as an old friend and said it had been a pleasure to work with him.
Can I pay tribute to my friend Daniel Andrews with the decision that he has made to stand down after 9 years as the Premier of Victoria. Daniel Andrews is a man of great conviction, enormous compassion and a fierce determination to make a difference. And he has made such a positive difference to the lives of Victorians.
But Victorian Liberal power broker Michael Kroger today remembered Daniel Andrews, yes, as a strong and decisive leader, but said he hadn't seen a worse Premier.
He leaves Victoria mired in corruption allegations, drowning in record debt, small business still broken and not recovered from his extreme measures during the lockdown. He leaves a broken, bankrupt state behind him, and I think many Victorians are pleased that he's gone. So that's his legacy, record debt. Andrew's great skill was two things. First of all, never admit fault unless it's minor on a Sunday morning. Even during Labor's worst scandals, he would just brush it off and carry on as if nothing had happened. Red shirts, the scandals with IBAC, his own appearances, etc. He's just dishing opponents. So the aura of invincibility was his greatest political skill.
Now, during the election campaign, Daniel Andrews said he would not be retiring this term in Parliament. He gave a commitment to voters to serve the full 4 years. But just 10 months into that 4-year term, he has now pulled the plug. 10 months after voters went to the polls and voted him back in. The election was just in late November 2022. Well, Daniel Andrews was asked about this broken promise today, and he shrugged it off and said he just changed his mind.
And it was true then, and I've changed my mind, Simon. And having explained to you in my statement and in my answer to Charnel's 2 questions, I hope that you have a sense that when it's time, it's time. And I don't think look. I'll just put it this way, perhaps. Doing this job requires a lot of hard work. It's not a complaint. It's just the nature of it. If you're going to do it properly. If you're going to do it to the best of your ability.
Oh, well, don't worry about breaking a commitment to millions of voters. He just changed his mind. Daniel Andrews said he came to this decision to retire very recently, and that once the thoughts crept in, he decided he had to move on.
I came to the decision fairly recently, and I was very keen to get the housing statement done, but I knew as we got to the final stages of that it would perhaps be the last big reform that I did. Ultimately, once those thoughts of what it'll be like after, what life will be like after this role start to creep in, you've got a really important choice to make. You either kind of push on and ultimately, I think, potentially resent the job, and you just never want to do that.
Daniel Andrews was 38 when he became leader of the Victorian Labor Party, and he took the party to victory in 2014, 2018 and 2022. Now, while Andrews said he only decided to resign in recent days, very good sources tell me that those close to him have been looking for job opportunities for him post his retirement for at least 2 months. So at least 8 weeks ago, calls were being made trying to find a job for Daniel Andrews after his retirement. Despite these calls looking for work, here was Daniel Andrews today saying he decided to leave when he was on top.
But there's an old saying in politics, go when they're asking you to stay. It's really important.
Not sure exactly who was asking him to stay, but let's have a look at Daniel Andrews' wins and blunders in office. Firstly, his successes. The level crossing removal project, he promised to remove level rail crossings by 2030. 72 of the 110 have already been removed. The Metro Rail Tunnel nearly finished. It'll introduce high-frequency trains to inner Melbourne. The Premier was praised for his bushfire response during the 2019-2020 Black Summer. Free kindergarten was very popular. He won 3 elections, as I've mentioned, and with a premiership of over 3,000 days, he'll be honoured with a statue, and he claims the title of the longest-serving Labor Premier for Victoria. Now let's have a look at his failures, and the list is somewhat longer. The suburban rail loop project, it's completely overblown its original budget by $75 billion and rising. The cancelled Commonwealth Games, and I'll come back to that in a minute. His draconian lockdowns that kept Melburnians in their homes for record-breaking weeks and months. The hotel quarantine disaster that cost over $500 million and 800 people died. Spiralling debt for the Victorian state, I'll also come back to that. And the corruption probes at the heart of his government. His collision also with a cyclist that we're still trying to get answers about. Then there's the ambulance wait times and the unnecessary deaths, the allegations of branch stacking across Victorian Labor. IBAC alluded to a toxic culture within the party. The fire services reform in 2016, highly controversial. The red shirt scandal where electoral officers were decked out in red campaign gear in marginal seats during the 2014 election, and the China-friendly Belt and Road Initiative that went against federal government advice and later laws. In terms of the Victorian economy, Andrews leaves the state in a far worse shape than when he stepped into the role. Victoria faces a financial crisis. Debt is ballooning. There are major budget blowouts, with debt forecast to reach $171 billion just in the next 3 years. Foreign Affairs editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan, wrote in a column a couple of months ago that in terms of debt and credit rating, Victoria is the worst performing government in Australia, with a tendency to authoritarianism that resembles Enid Blyton rewritten as a socialist dystopia. Part of Andrews' legacy will be the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. He refused to apologise for this repeatedly, despite letting down young, hopeful athletes both here and around the world. He said he had nothing to say sorry for. And that was just 15 months after celebrating that the state would be hosting the games that he bid for. He's now been blamed for killing off one of the great sporting events in Commonwealth history. And he was Stalin-esque in his deceit when this unfolded. He pretended he'd cancelled the event because he was doing a great thing for hospitals and housing. Instead, the games were cancelled on the basis of sloppy costings and a state in a debt crisis. The Australian Financial Review's editorial at the time said of the Commonwealth Games saga that surely this is the last straw for Mr Andrews and the madness of his left-wing populist governing model in excessively locking down the state during the pandemic while racking up debt on one spending monument after another. The Fin Review wrote the latest result of abruptly cancelling the Games, with almost 300 events and 5,000 athletes, now puts the whole Andrews shambles on the global stage. There have also been criticisms about the culture that Andrews led in several corruption reports, and we've seen that arrogance was his signature style at press conferences, plus a refusal to ever admit he was wrong. Now, on his way out today, Daniel Andrews said he'd never cared about being popular and that he'd never complained about the crises he'd had to deal with as Premier. Have a look.
Perhaps you've not ever really understood this about me. Like, I've never complained about the fact that we had to deal with fire and flood and a 1 in 100 year pandemic. That's the job. The job is dealing with all comers and all issues. And it's not an easy job. If it was easy, it would be nowhere near as important as it is. So I've never once complained about what we've had to deal with. That's just life. That's where we're at. But I only know one way to deliver against those challenges, and that's to do the right thing, not to try and be pandering, listening to the loudest voices, trying to be popular.
So Daniel Andrews there saying he never cared about being popular, but this is despite opinion polls and focus group research being conducted before he took decisions about COVID lockdowns and restrictions. Andrews undoubtedly is a divisive political figure, and not just within Victoria, but right around the country. In terms of his legacy, it's inseparable from the way he handled the pandemic. While voters in New South Wales warmed to Gladys Berejiklian, in Victoria, Daniel Andrews became extremely controversial. He became known for his lack of empathy, for unfair decisions on putting children out of school for so long, impacting their mental health, just young children. Also for his tough authoritarian approach that we later learned was at least in part based on polling and research. He'll always be known for these brutal lockdowns, with Melbourne receiving the unwanted honour of having the world's longest lockdown. His resignation today comes as controversies are piling up for the Premier, and just days after his good friend, Anthony Albanese, announced a COVID inquiry that wouldn't examine the decisions Andrews made as Premier during the pandemic. Well, Andrews says he's now planning to take time off, play golf and read some books. He says he's worse than a workaholic and he doesn't know what he'll finish up doing, but one thing's for certain, we can predict he'll probably land a cushy, well-paid job with one of his many Victorian mates. But the question now is whether Andrews leaving politics gives the Liberals a look in at the next election. Here was opposition leader John Pesutto today, slamming Andrews on his way out. Now, they're strong comments, but Pesutto can only dream of serving the 9 years as Premier that Daniel Andrews has achieved.
And the facts are that Premier Daniel Andrews is standing down today because things have fallen apart. The legacy that Daniel Andrews leaves is a state that is broke. Daniel Andrews' legacy is that he trashed Victoria's reputation, not only around our country. Daniel Andrews trashed Victoria's reputation around the world. But we have to face the facts. He's leaving because Victoria, under his leadership and his government, is falling apart.